Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. I have always been fascinated by old libraries. There is something magical about walking through corridors filled with untold stories, where time seems to have stopped. The New York Public Library was my favorite. Its grand architecture, with marble columns and high ceilings, gave a sense of reverence that I rarely found anywhere else. I used to go there every week, sitting at a table near a large window, where the sunlight would gently stream in, illuminating the pages of the books. The smell of old paper, mixed with the subtle fragrance of polished wood, created a warm and familiar atmosphere. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. It was just a quiet library where students, writers, and book lovers gathered to seek knowledge or simply enjoy a good novel. But over time, I began to notice small things that left me intrigued. The corridors were silent, so silent that the sound of a page turning seemed to echo off the walls. And yet, every now and then, I had the strange sensation of not being alone, even when I knew there was no one else around. It was as if something or someone was watching me from between the shelves. One afternoon, while I was deeply immersed in a book, I heard a subtle, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whisper, low and indistinct, as if someone was speaking right next to me. I lifted my head, looking around, but there was no one there. I thought it might be my imagination, a result of hours of uninterrupted reading. I went back to my book, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was beginning to form in my chest. But that was just the beginning. That afternoon, while I was absorbed in my reading, something strange happened. I was sitting at my usual table, with a thick book about the history of New York open in front of me. Suddenly, a slight movement caught my attention. I looked at the shelf to my right and saw one of the books slowly moving outward, as if an invisible hand was pulling it. I froze, my eyes fixed on the book that inexplicably slid to the edge of the shelf before falling to the floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the empty corridor, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up hesitant and picked up the book from the floor. It was an old volume of poems, with a worn leather cover. I put it back on the shelf, trying to push away the growing sense of unease. In the days that followed, the phenomena became more frequent. It wasn't just a book falling here or there. Sometimes, as I walked through the corridors, I heard whispers that seemed to come from all directions, but I could never pinpoint their origin. They were low voices, almost like murmurs, speaking in an urgent tone that I couldn't understand. Other library goers began mentioning strange things as well. A student who always sat near me said that one night, while reviewing her notes, she saw a shadow pass quickly between the shelves. An elderly man, who came every morning to read the newspaper, said he felt a cold touch on his shoulder, but when he turned around, there was no one there. These reports only increased my unease. One night, as I was getting ready to leave, I heard a low, anguished cry coming from a nearby reading room. I ran to see if someone needed help, but when I got there, I found the room empty. The lights flickered for a moment, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and then the silence returned, oppressive and heavy. The library, once a tranquil refuge, began to transform into a place of mystery and fear. Something was clearly wrong, and the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, only intensified each day. One night, I decided to stay at the library later than usual. I was determined to understand what was happening. While most of the lights were already off, the study areas remained dimly lit, casting long shadows through the shelves. I was in one of the deepest corridors of the library, surrounded by old and forgotten volumes. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence, the sound of a book falling to the floor once again. This time, I went there without hesitation, adrenaline rushing through my body. I found the book on the floor, open to a specific page. The unease was growing, but I pressed on. As I crouched to pick up the book, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They seemed to form words, but in a language I did not recognize. The whispers came from all directions, enveloping me in a cacophony of spectral voices. I stood up slowly, trying to locate the source, but it was impossible. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking. And then I saw it. A nebulous figure appeared at the end of the corridor. It looked like a man, dressed in antiquated clothing, perhaps from a century ago. He was facing away from me, but there was something deeply unsettling about his presence. When I tried to approach, he turned slowly, revealing a pale, expressionless face, with eyes that seemed empty, like black holes. My heart raced, and I took a step back, shocked by the sight. Before I could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like mist. Fear took hold of me, but there was a part of me that wanted to understand, wanted to confront the unknown. I continued to walk through the corridors, the whispers still accompanying me, now more insistent, almost aggressive. I reached the main reading room, where the tables were arranged in orderly rows. Shadows danced on the walls, and the whispers intensified, forming a wall of sound that seemed to press against me. Suddenly, all the books on the shelves began to tremble, and some were thrown to the floor with force. The lights flickered, plunging the room into a sequence of flashes of darkness and light. It was then that I saw another apparition, this time of a woman in a long, old-fashioned dress. She floated above the floor, moving slowly towards me. Her eyes, unlike the man's, were filled with pain and despair. When she got close enough, her mouth opened, but the sound that came out was a silent scream, an expression of agony that echoed in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the library, my heart pounding uncontrollably. When I reached the street, the cold New York night enveloped me, but the feeling of terror didn't diminish. Something deep and disturbing was happening in that library, something I could no longer ignore. The next morning, I returned to the library, determined to find a rational explanation for what I had witnessed. The daylight softened the fear a bit, but the feeling of unease persisted. I went straight to the information desk and looked for the oldest librarian I knew, a man named Mr. Collins. He had been at the library for decades, and if anyone knew anything about the strange occurrences, it would be him. I approached Mr. Collins, who was organizing some books. "And Mr. Collins, I need to talk to you about something strange that's happening here," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me with a curious, yet unsurprised, expression. What exactly did you see?" He asked, putting the books aside. I told him about the books moving on their own, the whispers, and the apparitions. As I spoke, Mr. Collins' expression grew serious. He sighed deeply before responding. There are stories about this library that date back a long time," he began. "Long before you and I were here, it's said that some terrible tragedies occurred. People disappeared, and some were found dead under mysterious circumstances. The building was constructed on the foundations of an old mansion that caught fire, killing several of its residents." I tried to process what he was saying. But these stories, they're just urban legends, right?" He shook his head slowly. "I wish they were. But since I started working here, I've heard similar reports to yours. Books moving, whispers in the shadows, apparitions. I believe there's something more happening here, something we can't explain with just logic." Despite Mr. Collins' words, my mind still sought a rational explanation. Maybe it was just drafts, illusions caused by the dim light, or even bad jokes. I decided to investigate on my own. I spent the next few days researching the library's archives, looking for any mention of the tragedies Mr. Collins had mentioned. I found old newspaper articles talking about disappearances and unexplained deaths in the area where the library now stands. There were even accounts from former librarians who claimed to have seen ghosts or heard voices. Each new discovery increased the tension within me, but I refused to completely believe in the supernatural. Perhaps there was a scientific explanation, something we didn't fully understand yet. But as the phenomena intensified, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that belief. One night, I decided to talk to some of the other library patrons. I asked if they had noticed anything strange. Many admitted to feeling a presence, hearing whispers, or seeing inexplicable movements. Some even reported recurring nightmares after spending long hours in the library. Despite all the evidence, there was still a part of me that refused to accept it. I needed definitive proof, something that couldn't be denied or explained rationally. And it was with this determination that I prepared for one last decisive night in the library, hoping to finally unravel the mystery surrounding it. That night, I returned to the library with renewed determination and a mix of fear and curiosity. I had with me a flashlight, a camera, and a voice recorder. If there was something to be found, I wanted to be prepared to document it. The building was almost empty when I arrived. Only a few readers remained, but they soon left, leaving me alone in the vast and silent library. The lights were turned off, except for a few emergency lamps casting a faint, flickering glow. I began my search in the deepest aisles, where the oldest books were kept. The air was dense, almost palpable, and every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. I turned on the flashlight and the recorder, advancing cautiously. I was flipping through an old history book when I heard the whispers again, louder and clearer than ever. They echoed between the shelves, forming words in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers turned into screams and wails, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy. Suddenly, the books on the shelves began to shake violently. Some were thrown to the floor, creating chaos with scattered pages. The light from my flashlight flickered, making it even harder to see what was happening. Then, a figure appeared at the end of the aisle. It was the same woman I had seen before, but now her appearance was even more terrifying. Her eyes were filled with pain and despair, and her mouth moved in a silent scream. She floated towards me, a few inches off the ground. Fear paralyzed me, but I knew I had to do something. I shouted at the apparition, trying to talk to her, but my words were lost in the tumult of screams and whispers around me. The figure came closer, and I could feel an icy chill emanating from her. Then, with a sudden movement, the woman vanished, and in her place appeared the man from before, with his pale face and empty eyes. He advanced quickly, and I felt a crushing pressure on my chest, as if I were being pushed back by an invisible force. I fell to the ground, struggling to breathe. The recorder slipped from my hand, but I continued filming, hoping to capture something. The figure of the man loomed over me, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time, sound, everything was suspended. But then, he dissipated into the air, and the library returned to silence. Panting, I slowly got up, my body trembling with fear. I gathered my equipment and ran to the exit, my heart pounding uncontrollably. I stepped out into the street, where the cold night air enveloped me, but the feeling of terror persisted. Whatever was in that library, I knew it was real. And despite all my attempts to find a rational explanation, I had finally confronted the supernatural in an undeniable way. Fleeing from the library, each step felt like a hammer pounding in my head, each breath a Herculean effort. When I finally reached the street, I leaned against a wall, trying to calm my racing heart and catch my breath. The New York night was cold, but the fresh air helped dissipate some of the dread that still enveloped me. I looked back at the library behind me, its imposing doors closed as if guarding ancient and terrible secrets. The facade, which once seemed welcoming and majestic, now looked like a monument of fear and mystery. My thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to process everything I had witnessed. The figures, the whispers, the moving books. There was no more denying it. Something profoundly supernatural resided in that place. In the days that followed, the experience in the library wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to return to my routine, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale face of the man and the desperate eyes of the woman. The whispering voices seemed to follow me, echoing in the corners of my mind, impossible to silence. I decided I could no longer frequent that place. The library, which had once been a refuge of peace and knowledge, had turned into a living nightmare. But curiosity still tormented me. What were those apparitions? Why were they trapped there, repeating their laments and silent screams? I spoke again with Mr. Collins, looking for some way to end it. He told me more about the ancient tragedies, about the restless souls that might still be trapped among the corridors and shelves. As sometimes the dead do not find peace, he said, with a sad look, and they cling to the places where their lives ended tragically. Those words stayed with me. I began to research more deeply into exorcism rituals and ways to free trapped spirits. But each new discovery only increased my anguish. There were no guarantees, and the idea of returning to the library filled me with terror. Eventually, I decided that the best option was to leave the past behind. Perhaps others would have more success in solving the mystery, but I could no longer risk it. The experience had marked me deeply, and I realized I needed to step away to take care of my sanity. Even today, when I pass near the New York Public Library, I feel a chill. The building stands there, imposing and silent, guarding its dark secrets. Sometimes, I hear stories from others who also felt or saw strange things, and I know I'm not alone. But I have distanced myself from that nightmare, aware that there are things we cannot explain, things we might never completely understand. And as I try to move forward, I know the library will always be there, a silent reminder that the unknown is closer than we imagine.